Hello and welcome to this short video. This is the second in a series of 100 on food law topics that I'm producing. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. This particular video is number 2 and it refers to the topic is primary production. Now you might be watching this as part of our YouTube channel, or you may be watching this on our online training website. If you've subscribed to our online training website, then in addition to this video, you'll be able to watch a webinar, which is about an hour long. You'll also have access to some additional materials, reference materials that you can download. Okay, so this is about primary production. What is primary production? Well, basically, primary production relates to farming, fishing, hunting. It's at that sort of level. We're talking a food hygiene topic here. So I'm referring to the food hygiene rules that apply on farm. Now, there are a number of activities, of course, that can be included within the definition of primary production. For example, the production and rearing and growing of plant materials, food producing animals, and indeed snails. Now, I should make the point that when dealing with primary production activities, one needs to include typically transport. So, for example, give an example of plant products. A farm might be growing carrots. The harvesting of the carrots, the storage of the carrots, the placing of the carrots into a barn and then maybe onto the back of a lorry to be moved on to a wholesaler, that would all be primary production. As long as nothing happens to the carrots other than maybe a little bit of washing, just perhaps removal of dirt, that sort of thing, then that's primary production. The basic rules of hygiene will apply. These basic rules of hygiene don't require a system based on HACCP principles, so there's no risk assessment required for the storage and movement of these very basic products, and the hygiene obligations, the requirements are much reduced. So for example, the conditions you would find in a barn storing carrots would be much reduced in terms of hygiene than those perhaps for the storage of carrots in a restaurant. So the obligations for primary production will apply to primary products as long as they're not further processed. If you have on farm harvesting of carrots, I've started with carrots, so I might as well carry on with carrots. The harvesting of carrots, and then maybe you're going a little bit beyond that, maybe peeling the carrots, dicing them, putting them into a polystyrene tray and putting a bit of cellophane over them, ready for supermarket. That type of activity, the actual cutting and dicing and putting into a container, that would actually not be primary production, and therefore the full hygiene requirements of hygiene law will apply to those activities. So often when dealing with primary production, it's the extent of the activities that is key. If you are fishing and catch fish, if those fish are merely landed, they can be gutted and then supplied on. They will be primary products, even in transport. However, if you're filleting the fish, or maybe you're portioning them, again, put them onto polystyrene trays, or that type of activity, or if it's a factory fish, a fishery vessel going out catching fish and going through a whole process, that's not primary production. That's moving into a much higher level of hygiene compliance. And typically, once you go beyond the primary production definition in hygiene law, it will trigger the need for a food safety management system. Other activities might be the milking and storage of milk on farm. It might be the collection of eggs. With eggs, if you're a farm or just a small business and you've got a few hens, you have a few eggs which you're maybe selling at farm gate, that's primary production, that's fine. However, if you're supplying those eggs to retail establishments, then they need to be Class A eggs to do that. It's a marketing standard, and there'll be a video on marketing standards and the food standards criteria on the online website. But basically, once you've got a Class A egg, Class A eggs can only come from approved establishments. So once you've got an egg packing station is the approved establishment I'm referring to here. So it's all a matter of degree. If you're supplying a small amount of eggs to the final consumer, then the primary production reduced hygiene rules will apply. If you're packing eggs to supply onto retail, then you would need approval as an egg packing station, and a system based on HACCP principles will be required for that activity. Fishing and handling of fishery products, as long as you don't change the nature substantially, that's what I've referred to already, is going to be a primary product, and that includes transport operations. But once you get into the freezer and factory vessels, then you've gone beyond that. Production, rearing, growing and harvesting of fish in aquaculture. Aquaculture, we're talking fish farms here. So the same thing applies if you've got a fish farm and all you're doing is you're rearing the fish and slaughtering fish and then transporting them on without substantially changing them, then that will be primary production. If you're actually filleting or perhaps packaging in some other way, then that may not be primary production. And again, the more detailed rules of hygiene law will apply. Production, rearing, growing, relaying and harvesting of live bivalve mollusks. So live bivalve mollusks we're talking about here, mussels, cockles, that sort of thing, and oysters, whatever. If you're just merely harvesting them, taking them off to a dispatch centre to be ready to be graded and sent on, this is primary production. However, going beyond that, again, would trigger additional requirements. Harvesting of mushrooms, berries, snails in the wild also falls within the scope of primary production. So what are the issues with primary production? Well, the European Food Safety Authority conducted some work on this a few years ago and produced this summary, which is behind me. You may or may not be able to read it, but don't worry, I'm going to quickly run through it. There are 5 key issues they identified, and they were talking about microbiological quality of fresh fruit and vegetables. One of the concerns at primary production is that you might get fruits such as soft fruits, such as say raspberries, contaminated. If you think about the surface of a raspberry, if you've got food poisoning bacteria or viruses on a raspberry surface, then very difficult for the consumer to wash them out, to get rid of them. So primary production has to be pretty careful to prevent contamination. So soft fruits and certain ready-to-eat vegetables, particularly things like salads, lettuce and things of that nature, are very susceptible to contamination. So, European Food Safety Authority identified environmental factors, including animal reservoirs. If you've got primary production of soft fruits or vegetables such as lettuce and ready-to-eat type vegetables, you want to make sure you haven't got animals wandering all over them, defecating or eating on them, or potentially cross-contaminating them. The use of fertilizers and plant protection products, so pesticides and things like that, but even putting on things like manure, not a great idea to put that on something like a soft fruit, for example. Water. Contamination by water has been identified as being a significant concern in primary production. If you're visited by an enforcement officer for the purposes of primary production, now I should put an aside, there is a different webinar which talks about enforcement agencies. Primary production is a hygiene issue, I talked about that already, but typically, for example in England, you will find that trading standards officers will commonly undertake primary production hygiene inspections. The reason for that is because they're normally on farms anyway, looking at animal feed, animal welfare. So it's just because they're there, they might as well take on a hygiene issue. Normally it's environmental health deal with hygiene, but with primary production, it does vary around the country. It's a matter for the local authority to decide themselves who will take the lead on this. But you will find in England, it's commonly training standards officers that would do that. One of the issues that training standards officers will look at is potability of water to make sure that contaminated water isn't being spread over crops. But then you've got the other 2 main cross-contamination issues, staff hygiene and health. There are separate videos on things like personal hygiene and fitness to work. One particular microbiological hazard associated with primary production is norovirus. So norovirus is a food poisoning virus. Much of it is environmental, and you can catch norovirus from person to person spread. But the concern is if you have someone suffering from norovirus symptoms and they are handling things like fresh fruit in a farm, then they may contaminate that fruit. And as I said, washing fruit at the end user can be quite difficult. And then you've got hygiene conditions at primary production, just general hygiene standards. We're talking about on farm, so we're not looking at the sorts of high level of hygiene standards you would expect in a restaurant or in a factory, but there has to be a basic level. And of course, that might well be just having additional or adequate facilities for staff so they can wash their hands, so that they can make sure that they're not contaminating foods themselves. Okay, so there we are. That's just a brief introduction to primary production. As I said, if you are a subscriber to our online website, then you will be able to access a webinar about an hour long and additional materials on this. That's just one of 100 videos that I'm producing on the YouTube channel. So stay tuned for the next one. Thanks very much for listening.